What if the Duchess the world adored wasn't the same woman behind closed doors? What if the radiant smile, the carefully chosen words about compassion, kindness, and progress concealed a darker truth, one witnessed not by tabloids, not by rivals, but by the very person employed to stand by her side? That's the question that has haunted palace corridors and whispers for years, and now, through the eyes of Amy Pickerel, Meghan Markle's former personal assistant, those questions demand answers. Because Amy wasn't just another aide in the background. She was handpicked, positioned as a bridge between the American actress turned Duchess and the rigid machinery of the monarchy. And what she saw, what she endured, would shake the illusion of royalty's newest star. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about it. How many times have you seen Meghan Markle walk across a red carpet or step out of a black car in her signature designer dresses, waving at the cameras with that Hollywood-trained ease? How many times did you believe the fairy tale that she was breaking barriers, modernizing the monarchy, bringing in warmth and humanity? But here's the contradiction that makes this story burn hotter than ever. Those very moments of sparkle were often the same days Amy would find herself on the receiving end of shouted orders, impossible demands, or emotional breakdowns triggered by Meghan's temper. The hook here isn't just gossip. It's betrayal. Because the public face and the private storm do not align, and that gap is precisely where truth lives. Let's rewind to the beginning. Meghan Markle entered the royal family under an avalanche of anticipation. The world was hungry for a modern princess, a woman of color stepping into one of the most archaic institutions on earth. The media sold her as a feminist warrior, a humanitarian, a breath of fresh air. And for a while, the story worked. Headlines painted her as a disruptor, crowds cheered her name, and photographs of Meghan and Harry holding hands became emblems of a fairy tale modern monarchy. But inside the walls of Kensington Palace, where titles and tiaras meant less than respect for tradition and protocol, a different reality unfolded. Staff were trained to serve with dignity, to anticipate needs, to support royals through invisible labor. These weren't just employees. They were caretakers of an institution that had survived wars, scandals, abdications, and crises. And into this world walked Meghan, who saw herself not as a member of that tradition, but as the star of her own production. This is where Amy Pickerel comes in. Amy wasn't new to the palace. She'd already built her reputation working with Prince Harry's communications team, earning respect for her diligence, discretion, and ability to navigate crises without flinching. When Meghan arrived, Amy was assigned the daunting task of guiding her transition into royal life. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, becoming the right hand of a woman who was both adored by millions and distrusted by insiders. Amy's first impressions? Meghan was magnetic, charming, articulate, and brimming with ideas. There was a warmth in her laugh and a laser focus in her eyes that could disarm anyone. It's easy to see why so many fell under her spell. But even in those early days, Amy noticed something unsettling, a sharpness in Meghan's tone when things didn't go her way, a tendency to snap when minor details weren't perfect. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder, more frequent, and harder to ignore. Let me ask you, have you ever met someone whose public kindness felt rehearsed, almost like a role they were playing? Someone who could light up a room with compliments, but in private reduce others to tears with a single remark? That's the contradiction Amy lived every day. There's one particular story whispered among palace aides. It's about Meghan's first big public appearance after the engagement, an event designed to show Britain and the world that this American outsider was ready for the role. The photos show her glowing, radiant, every hair in place. But backstage, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Meghan reportedly berated staff over last-minute seating arrangements, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Amy stood nearby, notebook in hand, forced to absorb every demand, every complaint, every icy glare. Yet the moment Meghan stepped out to face the cameras, she transformed, smiling, gracious, the Duchess the world adored. Do you see the irony? The woman who spoke about kindness and empathy often displayed neither to the very people who made her image possible. And Amy knew this better than anyone. But why does Amy's story matter now? Because silence has power, and breaking it has consequences. For years, Palace staff adhered to the unspoken rule: never complain, never explain. Aides resigned quietly, whispers stayed in corridors, and the public never saw behind the curtain. But Amy's decision to speak, years later, signals something far more profound. It isn't just about Meghan's behavior. It's about the erosion of trust between the monarchy and the very machinery that sustains it. It's about the clash of Hollywood glamour with centuries-old tradition. And it's about the cost of unchecked power when a public image becomes more valuable than private truth. The buildup of this story isn't a single scream or one impossible demand. It's the pattern, the accumulation of countless small acts of cruelty, disregard, and superiority that finally broke the silence. Meghan's defenders argue she was under pressure, hounded by the press, misunderstood by the establishment. And yes, there's truth to that. But does pressure justify screaming at junior aides until they cry in the palace bathrooms? Does stress excuse treating assistants like disposable servants rather than human beings? That's the contradiction that makes Amy's story so explosive. Let's linger on Amy herself for a moment. Picture her, mid-30s, polished but approachable, working endless hours to smooth the transition of a duchess who seemed determined to rewrite the rules. She wasn't just taking notes and scheduling meetings. She was carrying Meghan's emotional baggage, absorbing the fallout of every tantrum, and shielding the outside world from the reality within. It's no exaggeration to say Amy was both bodyguard and buffer, an invisible wall between Meghan's tempestuous moods and the institution she had married into. Now, imagine being in Amy's shoes. You're loyal to the crown, but you're also human. You watch colleagues resign under pressure, see staff reduced to hushed tears, and yet, you're expected to stay silent, to smile, to keep the machine moving. How long would you last before breaking? This story matters now because the myth of Meghan Markle as the compassionate humanitarian is still being sold through interviews, documentaries, and staged public appearances. But myths only survive until the truth claws its way out. And that's exactly what Amy's revelations threatened to do. And here's the twist. Amy wasn't the only one. Her story fits into a pattern echoed by other aides who left abruptly, citing unbearable pressure or toxic work environments. But Amy's voice carries weight because she was trusted, because she had been chosen, and because she witnessed Meghan at her most unfiltered. So let me leave you with this. If Meghan Markle's closest aide, the woman handpicked to guide her into royal life, describes her as a diva who screamed, berated, and demanded the impossible, what does that say about the Duchess's carefully crafted public persona? And if that image collapses, what does it mean for the monarchy's gamble in embracing her? Because Amy Pickerel didn't just walk away from a job. She walked away from the illusion of a duchess. And in doing so, she left behind a story that may redefine how history remembers Meghan Markle. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the illusion of a fairy tale starts to crack, not under the weight of scandalous headlines or paparazzi lenses, but in the quiet, unguarded moments seen only by those closest to the throne? That's where Amy Pickerel comes in. She wasn't just another nameless palace aide. She wasn't a tabloid source fishing for gossip. She was inside the storm, the assistant handpicked to shepherd Meghan Markle into royal life. And from that privileged yet perilous position, she watched the Duchess transform from the smiling star of the balcony into someone unrecognizable behind closed doors. Imagine being assigned to shadow a woman the world was obsessed with, a woman hailed as the monarchy's future, a symbol of progress. Your role? To keep her happy, to keep her calm, to make the impossible possible. Sounds glamorous, doesn't it? Until you realize that the glamour is nothing more than a veneer, and the real job is surviving the daily explosions of a boss who thrived on control. Here's the contradiction that sets the stage for everything that follows. Amy Pickerel began her job with excitement, even admiration. She wanted Meghan to succeed. She believed in the fairy tale. But the longer she worked, the more she realized she wasn't serving a duchess. She was serving an ego. Who exactly was Amy Pickerel? Let's rewind. She was a seasoned professional, respected inside the palace walls long before Meghan arrived. She worked in Prince Harry's communications office, a trusted figure known for her calm under pressure. She wasn't starstruck. She wasn't naive. She knew how the palace operated, how to balance tradition with modern expectations. When Meghan came on the scene, Amy seemed the perfect fit, young enough to relate, professional enough to manage the scrutiny, and discreet enough to keep secrets buried. But here's the twist. The very qualities that made Amy invaluable also made her vulnerable. Because Meghan didn't just need an assistant. She needed someone who could carry her frustrations, shield her from criticism, and bend to her will. And Amy, loyal to her job and eager to protect the monarchy, became that shield. Let's paint the scene. It's Meghan's first weeks as Duchess of Sussex. Crowds line the streets. Reporters jostle for photographs. Every dress, every smile, every word is dissected by the media. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere is electric. There's pride, anticipation, even hope that Meghan's arrival will rejuvenate the monarchy. But behind the applause, whispers begin. Staff notice the late-night phone calls, the endless demands, the sudden outbursts when details aren't perfect. And at the center of it all, Amy, who's expected to take it all in stride. Have you ever been around someone who could switch personalities in an instant? One moment warm, engaging, even affectionate, and the next cold, sharp, almost unrecognizable? That's what Amy saw daily. Meghan's charm was undeniable in public, but in private, her words could cut like glass. There's a story from early on, whispered among insiders, about Meghan's first official engagement after her wedding. The world saw her glowing, hand in hand with Harry, beaming at well-wishers. But backstage, Meghan allegedly unleashed fury over a small detail gone wrong. The wrong flowers, the wrong timing, a chair in the wrong position. To her, it was a disaster. To everyone else, it was trivial. And to Amy, it was a nightmare. She stood there, absorbing the torrent, knowing she couldn't argue, couldn't push back. Her role was to fix it, fast, and to act as though nothing had happened. Here's the irony. Meghan Markle spoke often about kindness, compassion, and respect. She framed herself as a champion of women, someone who wanted to lift others up. And yet, the very women working under her often left meetings in tears. Junior aides whispered about her impossible standards. Some described feeling more like personal servants than professionals. And Amy? She was the one caught in the middle, the witness to the contradiction between Meghan's words and her actions. But here's where it gets even more dramatic. Amy wasn't just an employee. She was also a confidant, a buffer between Meghan and the institution. Meghan leaned on her heavily, relying on her to manage the fallout of every storm. That dependency gave Amy unique insight into Meghan's true character. And what she saw wasn't just diva behavior. It was entitlement. It was manipulation. It was control at a level the palace had rarely encountered before. Let's stop here and ask, why would Amy stay? Why endure the shouting, the impossible demands, the constant pressure? Because walking away wasn't that simple. In the royal household, silence is golden. Loyalty is everything. Aides aren't just employees. They're guardians of the monarchy's survival. To resign suddenly, or worse, to speak out, risked not only their careers but the stability of the institution itself. And Amy, despite the turmoil, was loyal. She wanted to believe Meghan could change. But loyalty only goes so far. Amy's colleagues began to notice her exhaustion. Late nights at the palace, endless lists of tasks, a constant sense of walking on eggshells. They worried about her, whispered among themselves that she was carrying too much. And slowly, Amy began to realize what they already suspected. This wasn't just a job. It was a war zone. And here's where the tension builds. Amy Pickerel, the woman trusted to protect Meghan, was beginning to question if the Duchess even wanted protection, or if she wanted domination. And once that question took root, the cracks in their working relationship widened. This wasn't just about shouting matches or slammed doors. It was about power. Meghan Markle wasn't satisfied being guided into royal life. She wanted to rewrite the script. She wanted the monarchy to bend to her, not the other way around. And Amy, by standing at her side, became both witness and victim to that ambition. But what did Amy do with what she saw? Did she push back? Did she confront Meghan? Or did she swallow her doubts and continue serving, hoping things would improve? That's where the story twists into something deeper. Because what came next would not only test Amy's patience, but force her to make a choice that would change her life forever. And it all began with the first scream that echoed through the palace halls. The scream wasn't the kind of sound you expect to hear echoing through the gilded corridors of Kensington Palace. It wasn't ceremonial, polite, or restrained. It was raw. It was sharp. And it came from Meghan Markle. Picture the scene. A crisp morning. Staff hurrying through the palace offices, each with a clipboard in hand, rehearsing schedules and confirmations for an upcoming engagement. These halls weren't used to chaos. They ran on tradition, precision, and the quiet hum of discipline. But that day, something ruptured the order. A single, piercing shout that froze people mid-step. Phones hung in midair. Pens stopped scratching across paper. And at the epicenter of it all was Meghan. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever worked for someone who could raise their voice so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that it made your heart race and your palms sweat, even when the anger wasn't directed at you? That's what royal staff felt that day. And Amy Pickerel, standing just feet away, wasn't just a bystander. She was the target. The outburst came over something seemingly small. A scheduling conflict. Meghan wanted a briefing moved up. Staff explained it wasn't possible. Protocol dictated certain meetings had to involve senior royals. But Meghan didn't care about protocol. She wanted her way, and she wanted it now. Her voice sliced through the room. Accusations flew. Incompetence, disrespect, betrayal. For a woman who preached compassion in public speeches, her words in private landed like daggers. Amy did what she always did. She tried to calm the storm. Her voice was even, her hands steady, her notebook open, ready to adjust plans. But here's the contradiction. Meghan didn't want solutions. She wanted submission. She wanted someone to absorb her fury, to stand there and take it. And Amy, loyal to her role, did exactly that. This was the moment the palace staff realized the whispers weren't exaggerations. Meghan's temper wasn't occasional. It was a pattern. And the screams? They weren't just about logistics. They were about dominance. Let's step back for a moment. The British monarchy thrives on appearances. Smiles in public, composure in private, and absolute control of narrative. When royals lose their temper, it happens quietly, behind doors, whispered about, but never heard. But Meghan's approach was different. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't soften her words. She unleashed them. And in a building where silence was sacred, her screams became unforgettable. What impact did this have? Junior aides, some barely in their 20s, began to fear working near her. They whispered about their dread of being summoned, about how one wrong word could lead to humiliation. Tears became common in the palace bathrooms. Staff turnover spiked. And through it all, Amy bore the brunt, managing the fallout, trying to keep Meghan's fury from leaking beyond the walls. But let me ask you, how long can anyone live in a pressure cooker like that before something breaks? How many times can you stand silently while someone shouts, belittles, and berates before you begin to lose pieces of yourself? Amy's endurance was remarkable, but even she had limits. Here's the irony that bites the deepest. At the very same time Meghan's screams echoed through palace corridors, she was delivering public speeches about women's empowerment and workplace respect. Crowds applauded. Headlines praised her passion. But for the staff who wiped their tears in quiet corners, those speeches rang hollow. It was like watching two versions of the same woman, and only one of them was real. Now, you might think these screams would reach the ears of senior royals, that someone would intervene. But the palace is a fortress built on silence. Complaints were discouraged. Grievances disappeared into the void. Staff were told to manage, to endure, to keep the show running. Because in the end, the monarchy's survival mattered more than any aide's feelings. And Meghan knew it. This gave her power. Real power. She understood that staff couldn't fight back, couldn't expose her, couldn't walk into the media and tell their side. And so she pushed. Harder, louder, further, until even seasoned employees began to wonder how much more they could take. Amy was often the first line of defense. When Meghan screamed, Amy absorbed it. When Meghan demanded, Amy delivered. And when Meghan crossed the line, Amy smoothed it over. But here's the tragic twist. The more Amy tried to shield Meghan, the more Meghan relied on her as a punching bag. Every scream reinforced the cycle. And every cycle pulled Amy deeper into exhaustion. There's one incident that still lingers in palace whispers. Late at night, after a grueling day of public appearances, Meghan called Amy back into the office. It was nearly midnight. Most staff had gone home. Amy arrived, tired but composed. Meghan launched into a tirade about how a speech hadn't been delivered with enough energy, how the lighting at an event had been unflattering, how someone, somewhere, had failed her. Amy listened, took notes, promised adjustments. But at one point, as Meghan's voice rose to a shout, a cleaner passing by the office paused, startled. Even they, used to the quiet monotony of after-hours palace work, froze at the sound. Meghan's screams weren't confined to Dalek. There's one incident that still lingers in palace whispers. Late at night, after a grueling day of public appearances, Meghan called Amy back into the office. It was nearly midnight. Most staff had gone home. Amy arrived, tired but composed. Meghan launched into a tirade about how a speech hadn't been delivered with enough energy, how the lighting at an event had been unflattering, how someone, somewhere, had failed her. Amy listened, took notes, promised adjustments. But at one point, as Meghan's voice rose to a shout, a cleaner passing by the office paused, startled. Even they, used to the quiet monotony of after-hours palace work, froze at the sound. Meghan's screams weren't confined to daylight. They bled into the night, relentless and unrestrained. And yet, the next morning, Meghan appeared radiant for photographers, smiling, gracious, every inch the perfect Duchess. The contradiction was unbearable. Amy knew the truth. She lived the truth. But the world saw only the performance. So let me ask you this. If the woman who preached compassion was capable of reducing her staff to tears with late-night tirades and public screams, what does that say about the authenticity of her carefully curated image? Amy wasn't ready to answer that question publicly. Not yet. But inside, the doubt was growing. The cracks were widening. And the screams, once shocking, became routine, a new normal in a palace that prided itself on order. But here's where the story twists. Because Meghan's screams weren't the only problem. They were just the beginning. The demands that followed, impossible, relentless, designed to keep everyone on edge, would push Amy and the rest of the staff beyond breaking point. And when those demands came, they weren't whispered. They were delivered like commands from a queen. But what Meghan demanded next would make the screams look tame, and it would test Amy's loyalty in ways she never imagined. What does it feel like to work for someone whose demands never end? Not the kind of requests you'd expect in a high-pressure environment, tight schedules, last-minute edits, or a flurry of meetings. No, these were demands that bent reality itself, demands that defied reason. And at the center of it all was Meghan Markle. For Amy Pickerel and the junior aides who orbited Meghan's world, life quickly turned into a marathon with no finish line. Meghan didn't just want things done. She wanted them done now, perfectly, and often in ways that clashed with centuries of palace protocol. It wasn't enough to plan meticulously. It wasn't enough to anticipate. If a request wasn't fulfilled instantly, it was treated as a failure, sometimes with consequences as loud as a scream. Let me ask you, have you ever worked under someone who acted like the universe itself should rearrange to their liking? That's what palace staff faced daily. Here's an example. Meghan would often demand entire wardrobes be reorganized overnight. Not by stylists, by her aides. Imagine being told at 11 p.m. that every outfit, every shoe, every accessory had to be laid out, steamed, labeled, and repacked for the next morning's event. For Amy, this wasn't a matter of preference. It was a command. And if anything was missing, or heaven forbid, wrinkled, the fallout was brutal. Then there were the call times. Midnight, 2 in the morning, 3 a.m. It didn't matter. Meghan would summon aides like Amy at any hour, expecting immediate responses. If a speech needed tweaking, Amy had to deliver. If Meghan wanted obscure details about an upcoming engagement, Amy had to know. If Meghan felt restless, aides had to be available to soothe her frustrations. Sleep became optional. Loyalty was measured by exhaustion. And here's where the irony bites. Meghan had positioned herself as a champion of mental health, publicly advocating for compassion and balance. Yet, behind the palace doors, her own staff were crumbling under stress. Aides whispered about burnout, about sleepless nights, about the constant dread of being summoned. Some described it as walking on glass, never sure which step would shatter into chaos. Amy, professional and resilient, tried to manage it. She kept her composure, smiled in public, reassured junior staff. But inside, she felt the weight. Meghan's impossible demands weren't just exhausting, they were dehumanizing. They blurred the line between assistant and servant. Let's pause here. Imagine being told to procure a specific brand of candle, only available overseas, within hours. Or being asked to conjure a private yoga studio out of nowhere in the middle of a royal tour. Or being forced to juggle a dozen conflicting schedules because Meghan had changed her mind at the last minute. Each request was more impossible than the last, and each failure became ammunition for Meghan's anger. But why did staff comply? Why didn't they push back? Because palace culture demanded obedience. Because Meghan carried the title of Duchess, and with it, the authority to command. And because aides like Amy were bound by loyalty, not just to Meghan, but to the monarchy itself. To refuse was unthinkable. To resist was dangerous. The toll was immense. Junior aides broke down in tears after long days of chasing unattainable goals. Some confided quietly to Amy that they couldn't endure much longer. Others resigned altogether, their departures explained publicly as personal reasons, but whispered privately as escape. The turnover rate around Meghan became alarming. Yet, in public, she continued to speak about empowerment and kindness. Do you see the contradiction? The woman who demanded empathy from the world showed little to those at her side. And here's the deeper twist. Amy wasn't just an observer. She was often the executor of these demands. When Meghan wanted impossible things, Amy was the one tasked with making them happen. She was the bridge between fantasy and reality. And every time she succeeded, Meghan's confidence in pushing boundaries grew. Let me give you a vivid scene. During a high-profile overseas tour, Meghan reportedly decided she disliked the planned schedule just hours before the day's events. She wanted changes, speeches moved, meetings canceled, visits rearranged. Amy scrambled, calling foreign dignitaries, apologizing profusely, trying to salvage relationships. To Meghan, it was simple. She had changed her mind. To Amy, it was a logistical nightmare with international consequences. But did Meghan thank her? Did she acknowledge the effort? According to whispers, the answer was no. Instead, Meghan pointed out minor flaws. A chair positioned incorrectly. A car arriving 30 seconds late. The impossible demands were never truly about solutions. They were about control. Ask yourself this. What kind of leader exhausts their team into submission instead of lifting them up? What kind of boss measures loyalty not by results, but by obedience to the absurd? Amy's patience was remarkable, but every new demand chipped away at her resolve. She began to wonder if Meghan even saw her staff as people, or merely as props in her carefully curated royal performance. And here's the kicker. The demands weren't just unreasonable, they were strategic. By overwhelming her staff, Meghan ensured they had no energy left to resist, no bandwidth to question, no strength to fight back. It was domination disguised as expectation. But the palace, as always, had its limits. Whispers began to circulate beyond the staff offices. Senior figures noticed the high turnover. They heard rumors of screaming, of crying aides, of impossible demands. And once those whispers reached the ears of the monarchy's inner circle, everything changed. Because Meghan's behavior wasn't just a problem for Amy anymore. It was becoming a problem for the crown itself. And that's when Meghan turned her fury not just on her staff, but on the youngest, most vulnerable aides, the ones least able to defend themselves. Have you ever seen someone lash out not at their equals, not at those who could push back, but at the people least equipped to defend themselves? That's exactly what began to happen inside Kensington Palace. Meghan Markle, already infamous among staff for her late-night demands and sudden tirades, started focusing her frustrations on the youngest and most junior aides, the very people who had entered the palace with wide-eyed optimism, believing they were part of something greater than themselves. This is where the story turns darker. Because while shouting at senior staff was shocking enough, those aides at least had experience, some degree of resilience, and occasionally, the connections to protect themselves. But junior staff? They were fresh graduates, interns, or newly appointed assistants, eager to prove their worth in an institution they dreamed of serving. They were the easiest targets. Picture it. A young aide, no older than 24, tasked with delivering briefing notes to Meghan before a public event. She'd stayed up half the night compiling them, double-checking every fact, formatting every page perfectly. She steps into Meghan's office, nervous but hopeful. Meghan scans the notes, frowns at a minor detail, and suddenly, the temperature in the room drops. Her voice sharpens. She tosses the papers back, accusing the aide of incompetence. The girl freezes, stammers an apology, her cheeks flushing red. But Meghan doesn't relent. She digs in, escalating, until the aide is blinking back tears. And Amy Pickerel is standing right there. Amy, the seasoned professional, sees what's happening. She knows this isn't about briefing notes. It's about control. It's about power. But what can she do? If she steps in, she risks becoming the target herself. If she stays quiet, another aide is humiliated. It's a lose-lose. And time after time, Meghan put her in that impossible position. Now, let me ask you, what does it say about someone when they use their status not to protect the vulnerable, but to crush them? There are multiple accounts, whispered in the palace, of Meghan reducing junior staff to tears. Some aides reportedly fled to bathrooms, sobbing quietly so no one would hear. Others confided in Amy late at night, confessing that they didn't think they could take it anymore. For some, working for Meghan wasn't just exhausting, it was traumatizing. Here's the irony that makes the whole situation sting even more. Meghan, in her speeches and interviews, positioned herself as a mentor figure, especially for young women. She championed female empowerment, spoke passionately about creating opportunities, and painted herself as a role model. But for the very young women serving her day to day, the reality was anything but empowering. Instead of building them up, she broke them down. Amy saw it all, and it tore at her. On one hand, she was bound by loyalty to the Duchess she served. On the other, she was human, watching people crumble under pressure they didn't deserve. She became the unofficial counselor of the team, the one who comforted crying aides, who tried to shield them from Meghan's wrath whenever possible. But here's the cruel twist. Meghan seemed to sense that loyalty, and she leaned into it, sometimes pushing Amy even harder. One palace aide described it like this: working for Meghan was like walking into a storm every day. You never knew if you'd be greeted with sunshine or struck by lightning. For Amy, who stood in the eye of that storm, the unpredictability was the hardest part. Because Meghan wasn't always cruel. Sometimes she was warm, effusive, even grateful. Those moments gave staff hope, made them think maybe things were changing. But inevitably, the storm would return. Now, think about this contradiction. In public, Meghan Markle was the Duchess of compassion, hugging schoolchildren, giving heartfelt speeches, smiling for cameras. But in private, junior staff were being scolded for things as trivial as the wrong brand of pen, the wrong shade of folder, the wrong tone in an email draft. It wasn't about mistakes. It was about control. And the palace couldn't ignore it forever. Word began to travel. Senior officials noticed the resignations piling up, the strained faces of young staffers, the whispers behind closed doors. They asked Amy quietly how things were going. She, ever loyal, downplayed the chaos. But deep down, she knew she was enabling something toxic. Let's pause here. Imagine being a 20-something aide, thrilled to land a job inside Kensington Palace, only to find yourself crying in bathrooms because the Duchess you admired had just torn you apart over something meaningless. Would you stay? Would you walk away? Or would you, like many did, carry the scars of that experience long after leaving? Amy's dilemma was brutal. She couldn't quit. Not yet. She was in too deep, too responsible, too loyal. But the guilt was mounting. She was watching Meghan's cruelty affect not just her own mental health, but the well-being of others. And she began to wonder, how much longer could she endure this before something snapped? And here's where the story twists again. Because Meghan's treatment of junior staff wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. It sent a message. It told everyone in the palace hierarchy that she was untouchable, that even the newest aide wasn't safe from her wrath. It was a display of dominance that rippled outward, creating an atmosphere of fear. But Meghan wasn't finished. The screaming and impossible demands had set the stage. The mistreatment of junior aides showed her disregard for hierarchy. And now, she was about to take things further, by clashing directly with the traditions of the monarchy itself. And that's where the real battle began. What happens when someone enters an ancient institution, not to adapt to it, but to bend it to their will? When Meghan Markle clashed with junior aides, it wasn't just about personalities or tempers. It was about power. And soon, that power struggle shifted from staff to the very foundations of palace tradition. And Amy Pickerel, trapped in the middle, saw firsthand how those clashes unfolded. The monarchy isn't just a family. It's a system. Every movement, every smile, every appearance is choreographed according to centuries of precedent. Staff don't just serve, they uphold that system. They ensure that the mystique of royalty stays intact, that the monarchy projects continuity, grace, and order. But Meghan? Meghan had no patience for that order. She saw protocol as an obstacle, not a guide. And when palace aides, including Amy, reminded her of those rules, she pushed back hard. Have you ever worked with someone who thinks rules don't apply to them? Someone who interprets every no as a personal insult? That's how Meghan operated. Take, for example, the royal dress code. For official engagements, guidelines were strict: conservative cuts, muted colors, polished accessories. Meghan wanted bold. She wanted Hollywood glamour. When aides gently explained why certain outfits weren't appropriate, Meghan dismissed them. If Diana could break the rules, why can't I? She reportedly snapped once. The irony? Princess Diana's subtle rebellions were calculated, symbolic acts that resonated with the public. Meghan's were more self-serving, designed not to honor tradition but to spotlight herself. Amy often found herself in impossible situations. Meghan would insist on a certain dress, knowing it broke protocol, and Amy would have to persuade palace officials to make exceptions. Sometimes she succeeded, sometimes she failed. But either way, Meghan's fury always landed on Amy. And it wasn't just clothes. Meghan challenged scheduling rules, press access, even seating arrangements at events. Once, during preparations for a state dinner, Meghan reportedly demanded that her personal friends be seated closer to senior royals, an unheard-of breach of etiquette. When staff pushed back, explaining that seating was dictated by hierarchy and protocol, Meghan exploded. Amy, once again, was caught in the crossfire, forced to soothe her while simultaneously apologizing to senior palace officials. Let's pause here. What does it say about someone when they see centuries of tradition not as a legacy to honor, but as a nuisance to bulldoze? The contradiction grew sharper with every clash. Meghan spoke often about modernizing the monarchy, about making it more accessible and relatable. But behind those lofty words was a simple truth. She didn't want to modernize the institution. She wanted to remake it in her own image. And every time an aide resisted, she interpreted it as betrayal. Amy bore the brunt of this. She was Meghan's shield against the institution, expected to make the impossible happen. When Meghan wanted photographers banned from certain events, Amy had to negotiate. When Meghan wanted private access that protocol didn't allow, Amy had to bend rules until they cracked. And when Meghan didn't get her way, Amy absorbed the blame. The stress was relentless. Other staff began whispering about Amy, how she always looked tired, how she seemed older, more worn down. Some pitied her, others resented her. They wondered why she stayed, why she put up with Meghan's demands. But Amy was loyal. She wanted to protect the crown. She believed, perhaps naively, that Meghan might soften with time. But then came the breaking point. During one public engagement, Meghan smiled and waved as usual, dazzling cameras with her warmth. But backstage, she erupted, furious that the flowers in her dressing room weren't the exact kind she'd requested. She shouted at staff, dismissed their explanations, and turned her ire on Amy. The irony was unbearable. The Duchess, who had just delivered a speech on compassion and kindness, was, minutes later, berating the very people who made that speech possible. And here's where Amy's loyalty began to crack. For the first time, she started to wonder if protecting Meghan was worth the cost. Now, let me ask you, what happens when loyalty collides with self-preservation? How long can someone stand in the fire before they either burn out or break free? This wasn't just a clash between Meghan and her aides. It was Meghan versus the monarchy itself. Every scream, every impossible demand, every broken protocol wasn't just a personal tantrum. It was a declaration of defiance. And Amy, stuck in the middle, knew the stakes were higher than anyone realized. Because the next time Meghan's fury erupted, it wouldn't be contained to junior aides or midnight phone calls. It would spill into the public eye, threatening the very image of the royal family. And that's exactly what happened next. At one of Meghan's most high-profile events, where the cameras captured her radiant smile, but behind the scenes, Amy witnessed a fury so shocking it nearly ended her career. What if I told you that the most iconic smiles we've seen from Meghan Markle, the hand waves, the camera-ready grins, the polished speeches, were sometimes followed, almost immediately, by backstage meltdowns that left aides trembling. That's not tabloid speculation. That's the reality Amy Pickerel and others lived through. And one particular event made it crystal clear. The mask Meghan wore in public was not the woman staff knew in private. The day began like any other royal engagement. Crowds lined the streets, waving Union Jacks. Photographers elbowed for position, desperate to capture that perfect shot of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Meghan stepped out of the car radiant, hair sleek, outfit immaculate, smile dazzling. To the world, it looked effortless. But for Amy, following a few steps behind, every detail had been a battle. The seating arrangements, the speech draft, even the type of water bottles backstage. Nothing was sim. Still, Amy did what she always did. She kept calm, notebook in hand, pen poised, ready to manage any crisis. Meghan breezed through the event, shaking hands, laughing at jokes, radiating warmth. The press gushed. The crowd adored her. But as soon as the cameras were gone, the temperature shifted. Backstage, Meghan's smile vanished. She turned to staff with a look that could freeze glass. The flowers in her private room weren't the exact shade she'd requested. The lighting during her speech had been, in her words, unflattering. The applause hadn't been enthusiastic enough. One by one, she unleashed her frustrations, her voice rising, sharp, cutting. Junior aides wilted under the barrage. Some looked at the floor, others blinked back tears. And at the center of it all was Amy, forced once again to absorb the storm. Let me ask you, have you ever watched someone flip from warmth to fury so quickly it felt like whiplash? That's what Meghan's staff endured. Amy tried to calm her, reminding her gently of how well the event had gone, how positive the press coverage would be. But Meghan wasn't interested in reassurance. She wanted perfection. And when reality didn't align with her vision, she lashed out. The contradiction was staggering. Minutes earlier, Meghan had stood before an audience, speaking passionately about kindness and community. Yet behind the curtain, she was tearing down the very people who made that moment possible. It was hypocrisy so stark, even seasoned aides struggled to process it. And here's the twist. These moments weren't isolated. They became a pattern. Public charm, private fury. Radiant smiles followed by venomous tirades. The palace began to notice. Senior officials, who prided themselves on maintaining control and dignity, heard whispers of Meghan's behavior. At first, they dismissed it as stress, adjustment, the natural tension of a new royal. But as the stories piled up, the whispers became impossible to ignore. Amy, loyal as ever, shielded Meghan when she could. She softened reports, downplayed incidents, tried to protect both Meghan and the monarchy. But deep down, she knew the truth. Meghan's treatment of staff wasn't just a symptom of stress. It was a choice. And here's where things get even more dramatic. Meghan's clashes with staff weren't confined to palace walls. They spilled outward into engagements that were supposed to showcase harmony. At one high-profile event, Meghan reportedly snapped at an aide within earshot of foreign dignitaries. The embarrassment was palpable. Amy rushed to smooth things over, but the damage was done. The cracks were showing. And the world, though still blinded by Meghan's charm, was closer than ever to glimpsing the storm beneath. Have you ever been in a situation where the truth is so obvious, yet no one dares to say it aloud? That's where the palace was. They saw the resignations piling up, the aides leaving quietly, the turnover unlike anything they'd seen before. They watched Amy, once vibrant and composed, grow thinner, paler, more strained. And still, silence reigned. But silence doesn't last forever. Because eventually, Meghan's fury turned not just on staff, but on tradition itself. She wasn't content to berate aides or demand the impossible. She wanted to bend the monarchy to her will. And when she couldn't, she grew even more combative. Amy saw it all. The arguments over schedules, the defiance of protocol, the disregard for centuries of order. And in one shocking moment, Meghan pushed so far, so hard, that Amy realized she was no longer just protecting an employer. She was protecting the monarchy itself. That was the moment Amy's loyalty began to fracture. She still hadn't spoken out, still hadn't betrayed the code of silence. But inside, something shifted. Because Meghan's battle wasn't just with staff anymore. It was with the crown. And what Meghan did next, at a public engagement where the entire royal machine was watching, would ignite a conflict that could no longer be hidden. What happens when someone decides that the rules of a thousand-year-old monarchy don't apply to them? That was the stage Meghan Markle set, and Amy Pickerel was stuck in the middle of the battle. Up until now, the drama had been contained. Screams behind closed doors, impossible demands in the middle of the night, aides fleeing in tears down palace hallways. But when Meghan started clashing openly with tradition, the conflict was no longer private. It became a direct challenge to the crown itself. And the consequences were far more dangerous. Let's step into the world of royal protocol for a moment. These aren't just old-fashioned niceties. They're the threads that hold the monarchy together, the rituals and rules that give the institution its sense of permanence and dignity. Where you stand in a lineup, how you enter a room, even who speaks first, every detail matters. Break those rules, and you don't just embarrass yourself. You embarrass the entire monarchy. But Meghan? She saw protocol as shackles. And every time Amy reminded her of those rules, it was like lighting a fuse. One incident has become almost legendary among palace whispers. A state banquet was being organized, formal, glittering, the kind of event that embodied centuries of royal grandeur. Seating plans were laid out with military precision. Senior royals, dignitaries, heads of state. Every placement signified status. Meghan, still new to royal life, was assigned a respectable but modest place at the table. She wasn't the star. Not yet. But when Amy relayed the seating chart to her, Meghan's fury erupted. "Why am I not next to the Queen?" she reportedly snapped. Amy, caught off guard, tried to explain hierarchy, tradition, protocol. Meghan didn't care. She wanted to be at the center of attention, not sidelined. And when Amy gently insisted that protocol couldn't be changed, Meghan accused staff of undermining her, of trying to embarrass her on purpose. Have you ever seen someone mistake structure for sabotage? That's exactly what Amy was witnessing. The same pattern repeated with press access. The Royal Rota, the group of accredited journalists who covered royal events, was a cornerstone of palace transparency. Meghan hated it. She wanted to handpick which outlets covered her, often favoring those she thought would praise her and banishing those who criticized. Amy tried to explain that wasn't how it worked. The Rota wasn't negotiable. Meghan bristled, insisting she should control her own narrative. And here's the contradiction. Meghan claimed she wanted to modernize the monarchy, to make it more open and relatable. But by shutting out the press, by breaking rules designed to ensure fairness, she wasn't opening the doors. She was closing them, tightening control around her image. Amy, once again, was left holding the pieces. She became the middlewoman in an endless tug-of-war, Meghan pulling one way, the palace pulling another. The strain was unbearable. But perhaps the most shocking clash came during preparations for Trooping the Color, the Queen's annual birthday parade, one of the most iconic royal events of the year. Traditionally, junior royals stand behind senior ones on the Buckingham Palace balcony. It's not a slight. It's protocol. But Meghan wasn't having it. She wanted a prime spot, front and center. Amy, tasked with relaying this uncomfortable truth, found herself in the line of fire once again. Meghan reportedly bristled at the idea of standing behind Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge. To her, it wasn't protocol. It was humiliation. Think about the irony here. Meghan had built her public persona on fighting for equality, breaking barriers, challenging hierarchy. But inside the monarchy, her battle wasn't for fairness. It was for dominance. Amy knew this was dangerous. The monarchy thrived on unity, on projecting an image of harmony. Every balcony appearance, every public event, was carefully crafted to avoid even the hint of rivalry. But Meghan's defiance threatened to shatter that illusion. And the pressure on Amy grew unbearable. She wasn't just managing Meghan anymore. She was managing the survival of royal tradition itself. One wrong move, one broken rule, and centuries of carefully cultivated image could collapse. Now let me ask you, what do you do when your boss demands the impossible? And refusing means defying someone with global influence. Do you protect tradition? Or do you protect yourself? Amy tried to do both. She bent rules when she could, pleaded with senior officials to make exceptions, smoothed Meghan's fury with gentle reassurances. But every compromise only emboldened Meghan further. The message was clear. If she pushed hard enough, she could win. And once she realized that, there was no stopping her. The irony? Every time Meghan won against protocol, she lost ground inside the palace. Senior royals began to take note. Trust began to erode. And Amy, once seen as a loyal and steady hand, found herself tainted by association. She wasn't just Meghan's aide anymore. She was Meghan's enabler. The emotional toll was devastating. Amy, who had once believed she could help Meghan find her place in the monarchy, began to see the truth. Meghan didn't want a place. She wanted the throne of her own making. And the breaking point was closer than anyone realized. Because soon, Meghan's clashes with protocol wouldn't just be whispered about in palace offices. They'd erupt in public, on a stage so large, so visible, that the entire world would see the cracks in the fairy tale. And when that moment came, Amy would be standing right beside her, caught in the fire. Have you ever seen someone smile so brightly for the cameras that you'd never guessed they had just finished shouting at the people who helped put that event together? That's the paradox Amy Pickerel lived through again and again. And nowhere was it more visible than during Meghan Markle's high-profile public engagements. Events meant to showcase compassion, unity, and charm. But that backstage revealed an entirely different story. It started like clockwork. Meghan would step out of the sleek black car, hand in hand with Harry, dressed in an outfit that would dominate headlines within hours. Cameras flashed. Crowds cheered. Children thrust bouquets into her hands. Meghan dazzled. To the world, it looked effortless, like she was born into this role. But for Amy and the team, every minute of that performance came at a cost few could see. Behind the curtain, the air often crackled with tension. Staff scrambled to make last-minute adjustments, sometimes to things Meghan herself had changed at the 11th hour. Flowers swapped. Chairs moved. Entire schedules rewritten minutes before events. And if even one detail fell short of Meghan's expectations, the smile would vanish the moment she was out of sight, replaced with sharp words that cut staff down like paper. Let me ask you, how long would you last working for someone who lived in two extremes? Sunshine in public, storms in private. Could you withstand that daily whiplash? One event in particular stands out in Palace Whispers. A charity appearance designed to highlight Meghan's humanitarian side. The cameras loved her, shaking hands with children, crouching down to eye level, speaking passionately about causes close to her heart. The audience was moved. Donors applauded. But the moment she slipped backstage, it all collapsed. Meghan reportedly berated staff for the positioning of a lectern, accusing them of sabotaging her speech by setting it at the wrong angle. She demanded to know why her notes hadn't been reformatted in the exact font she preferred. Her voice rose, sharp, relentless. Junior aides froze, terrified. And Amy? Amy stepped in, as she always did, absorbing the fury, promising fixes, smoothing the edges of a storm that felt endless. Here's the cruel irony. The very events that earned Meghan global praise often became the settings for her most explosive backstage behavior. The louder the applause outside, the harsher the criticism inside. It was as if the perfection of the public performance only intensified her dissatisfaction in private. And Amy saw it all. The emotional toll on staff was staggering. Some described it as walking on eggshells. Others called it survival mode. But the pattern was undeniable. Meghan would shine for the cameras, then unleash her frustrations when the doors closed. It created an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion. Aides dreaded public engagements not because of the events themselves, but because of what came after. Now, think about the contradiction here. Meghan's entire public brand was built on empathy, on compassion, on lifting others up. But for those working closest to her, empathy was the one thing they rarely experienced. The woman who hugged strangers sometimes couldn't extend the same grace to her own team. Amy, once so hopeful about helping Meghan integrate into royal life, began to crack under the strain. She tried to hide it, professional, polished, always ready with a reassuring smile. But colleagues noticed. The circles under her eyes. The way she flinched at the sound of Meghan's voice. The exhaustion etched into her posture. Behind the notebook and pen, behind the calm exterior, Amy was burning out. And yet, she stayed. Why? Because leaving wasn't that simple. She wasn't just Meghan's aide. She was a servant of the monarchy. Quitting would raise questions. Speaking out was unthinkable. So she endured, hoping things would improve, hoping Meghan would soften with time. But deep down, she knew the pattern was too entrenched to break. Here's where the story takes a chilling twist. At one event, Meghan's backstage fury grew so intense that even Harry reportedly intervened. He asked her to calm down, to lower her voice. But instead of cooling the fire, it only fanned the flames. Meghan turned on him too, accusing him of siding with staff, of undermining her. Amy watched, stunned. In that moment, she realized it wasn't just about staff anymore. Meghan's fury was spilling over into her marriage, into the very core of the royal family. And that's when Amy's internal conflict grew unbearable. She wasn't just protecting an employer anymore. She was witnessing the unraveling of a duchess's relationship with the monarchy, and possibly even her own husband. So let me ask you this. If you were Amy, how long would you keep sacrificing your own well-being to protect someone who seemed determined to destroy everything around her? The cracks were widening. The smiles were thinning. And the next time Meghan erupted, it wouldn't just leave aides and tears. It would push Amy herself to the breaking point. Because soon, Amy would face a moment so humiliating, so painful, that it nearly ended her career. And Meghan Markle would be the one holding the match. Have you ever wondered what a breaking point really looks like? Not the kind you see in movies, with dramatic music swelling in the background, but the quiet, personal collapse that happens when someone has endured too much for too long. That's what Amy Pickerel finally faced. And it wasn't because of one scream, one impossible demand, or one humiliating backstage meltdown. It was because of all of them, layered, repeated, compounded until even the strongest wall began to crack. Amy had always prided herself on her resilience. She'd survived the grinding machine of palace communications. She'd worked long hours in high-pressure environments. She knew what it meant to be discreet, loyal, and composed. But nothing had prepared her for Meghan Markle, for the endless demands, for the volatility, for the contradictions that made every day feel like a test she could never pass. The moment of collapse came during what should have been a routine day, a mid-level engagement. Nothing as grand as a state banquet, nothing as high stakes as trooping the color. But sometimes, it's not the grand battles that break you. It's the little wars, the thousand cuts of impossible expectation. That morning, Amy had already been up since 4 a.m. Meghan had called her repeatedly the night before, furious about the wording of a press release. By the time Amy arrived at the palace, she was exhausted. Still, she pressed on, organizing briefing notes, coordinating staff, preparing schedules. She knew the drill. She knew the dangers. But Meghan was already on edge. The dress wasn't right. The car wasn't punctual enough. The aides hadn't prepared the right kind of pens. Yes, pens. Meghan reportedly fixated on the smallest details, and in her mind, nothing was too small to justify outrage. By mid-morning, the tension was unbearable. Staff avoided eye contact. Junior aides whispered in corners. Amy, notebook in hand, tried to hold the line. And then it happened. In front of multiple staff, Meghan snapped, this time at Amy directly. She accused her of incompetence, of failing to anticipate needs, of embarrassing her. The words came sharp, fast, cutting. But it wasn't the first time Amy had been shouted at. What made this different was the audience. Junior aides watched, stunned, as their leader, the woman they relied on, was torn down in public. Have you ever been humiliated in front of others by someone you worked tirelessly to protect? That moment doesn't just sting, it shatters something deep inside. Amy kept her composure. She always did. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She stood still, calm, professional. But inside, something broke. She realized she wasn't just enduring abuse anymore. She was being made an example of. Meghan wasn't just venting frustration. She was establishing dominance. And Amy, the loyal aide who had given everything, was being used as a warning to others. No one was safe. Afterward, the whispers spread. Junior aides spoke of Amy's humiliation with shock and pity. Some wondered how much longer she could last. Others quietly admitted they would have walked out that very moment. But Amy didn't. Not yet. Because even in that moment of betrayal, she still felt trapped. By loyalty, by duty, by the unspoken rule of palace life. Never complain, never explain. But the cracks were visible. Amy began to withdraw. Her usual warmth was dimmed. Her energy was gone. She looked exhausted, drained, almost ghostly. Colleagues noticed. Even senior officials began to wonder how much more she could take. And here's where the story twists again. Meghan, instead of recognizing the damage, doubled down. She pushed harder, demanded more, leaned even heavier on Amy. Because Meghan had come to rely on her completely, not just as an assistant, but as a shield, a scapegoat, a buffer between her and the world. And the more Amy crumbled inside, the more Meghan seemed to use her. Let me ask you this. What kind of relationship survives when one person feeds on the other's exhaustion? How long before the weaker one breaks entirely? For Amy, that day was fast approaching. Her breaking point wasn't just personal. It was professional. She began to realize that Meghan's storms weren't isolated tantrums. They were jeopardizing the institution itself. Staff morale was collapsing. Resignations piled up. The palace's image was under threat. And Amy, the one person closest to Meghan, was being dragged down with her. This wasn't sustainable, and Amy knew it. But before she could make her exit, before she could reclaim her life, she would face one final storm. A moment so shocking, so raw, that it would not only cement her decision to leave, but also reveal Meghan's true attitude toward the monarchy itself. And that moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. What happens when the storm you've been managing behind closed doors suddenly collides with the very institution you've sworn to protect? That was Amy Pickerel's reality when Meghan Markle's fury began shifting from staff to the monarchy itself. Up until then, the chaos was survivable. Humiliations, screams, impossible demands, all absorbed by aides like Amy who believed their role was to protect the crown from scandal. But when Meghan turned her frustration on the monarchy, the stakes changed entirely. This wasn't about pins or flowers anymore. It wasn't about who fetched the right bottled water or who misread an email. This was about Meghan challenging the very system she had married into. And Amy, caught in the middle, realized she was no longer just managing a difficult boss. She was standing on the fault line of a battle between an ambitious Duchess and the centuries-old institution of the British crown. The shift happened gradually at first. Meghan would mutter under her breath about outdated traditions. She'd scoff at certain protocols, roll her eyes at senior royals, dismiss staff explanations with a wave of her hand. Amy, ever the mediator, tried to smooth it over. "It's just how things are done," she'd say. But Meghan didn't want explanations. She wanted change. Immediate, sweeping, total change. One aide later confided that Meghan once declared, "This whole system is archaic. Why should I have to play by rules written for someone else?" On the surface, it sounded like a call for modernization. But in practice, it meant clashing head-on with traditions that had survived kings, queens, abdications, and wars. Amy saw Meghan's defiance play out in the smallest and biggest ways. At official events, Meghan would insist on speaking out of turn, ignoring the subtle hierarchy that dictated who addressed the public and when. She would push to have her own projects prioritized over established royal initiatives, demanding staff resources be redirected. And when denied, she took it as a personal insult, convinced the palace was plotting against her. Have you ever dealt with someone who mistakes structure for sabotage? That was Meghan, again and again. And here's the irony. Meghan sold herself as a reformer, a modernizer. She told the public she wanted to bring warmth, compassion, and humanity to the monarchy. But behind closed doors, her rebellion wasn't about lifting the system. It was about centering herself. Every clash with tradition, every defiance of protocol, made Amy's job more impossible. Because Amy wasn't just protecting Meghan anymore. She was being forced to protect the monarchy from Meghan. The breaking point came during a private meeting, attended by Meghan, senior aides, and palace officials. Meghan had pushed for a new initiative, one designed entirely around her personal brand. It clashed with other royal commitments, but Meghan wouldn't back down. She argued heatedly, insisting she should have free rein to run her projects however she saw fit. When palace officials explained why it couldn't be done, Meghan's voice rose. She accused them of trying to silence her, of undermining her power. Amy sat frozen. She watched Meghan take aim not just at staff, but at the institution itself. And in that moment, she realized the truth. Meghan didn't want to be part of the monarchy. She wanted the monarchy to bend to her. Now, think about that for a moment. The monarchy survives because no one person is bigger than the institution. Even queens and kings are bound by its traditions. And here was Meghan Markle, still new to the family, trying to bulldoze centuries of structure because she believed she knew better. The room was tense. Senior officials exchanged glances. Some looked at Amy, as if expecting her to step in, to calm Meghan, to manage the unmanageable. But for the first time, Amy couldn't, because deep down, she knew Meghan had crossed a line that couldn't be smoothed over. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a declaration of war. And here's the contradiction that makes this moment so haunting. Meghan positioned herself publicly as a victim of the system, claiming she was silenced, marginalized, pushed aside. But privately, Amy saw something entirely different. Meghan wasn't silenced. She was loud. Meghan wasn't powerless. She was pushing everyone around her. Meghan wasn't marginalized. She was demanding center stage. Amy walked out of that meeting shaken. She knew something had shifted. Meghan was no longer content to scream at aides or berate junior staff. She was taking on the crown itself. And Amy, once her loyal defender, began to question whether she could keep playing her part. But Meghan wasn't finished. Her defiance would only grow louder, more public, more dangerous. And soon, Amy would be forced to make a choice. Stay and be consumed by the chaos, or walk away and risk everything. And just when Amy thought the storm couldn't get worse, when she believed she had seen Meghan at her most combative, what came next blindsided her completely. Because Meghan was about to give her an ultimatum that would change Amy's life forever. What do you do when loyalty collides head-on with survival? That's the question Amy Pickerel faced the moment Meghan Markle delivered her ultimatum. After months of screams, impossible demands, and defiance of palace tradition, Amy had reached her breaking point. But Meghan wasn't about to let her slip away quietly. She wanted control over her image, over her staff, over her narrative. And she was about to make sure Amy understood that walking away came with consequences. It began with whispers. By this stage, palace staff were already gossiping quietly that Amy was stretched to her limit. They saw her exhaustion. They saw how thin she had grown, how her usual calm composure was fraying at the edges. Some wondered if she would quit. Others thought she was too loyal, too bound by duty, to ever walk away. But Meghan saw it too. And unlike the others, she wasn't worried. She was angry. To Meghan, Amy leaving wasn't just about losing an aide. It was about losing her shield. Amy had become more than an assistant. She was the buffer who absorbed Meghan's temper, who smoothed over her outbursts, who kept damaging stories from reaching the palace higher-ups. Without Amy, Meghan would be exposed. And Meghan couldn't allow that. So when Amy quietly began to hint that she couldn't carry on, Meghan struck back. Imagine being called into a private meeting with someone who has already humiliated you publicly countless times. You expect shouting. You expect demands. But this time, Meghan's tone is different. Colder. Sharper. She looks Amy in the eye and lays down the ultimatum. If you walk away, I'll make sure everyone knows you failed me. Have you ever been threatened by someone you once defended, someone you believed in? That's the betrayal Amy felt in that moment. It wasn't an idle threat. Meghan knew exactly what she was doing. She understood the palace's obsession with reputation. If she painted Amy as incompetent, as unable to manage her workload, it wouldn't just ruin Amy's career. It would stain her name in circles where discretion and loyalty were everything. For a royal aide, reputation was survival. And Meghan was threatening to take that away. Amy sat frozen. Her heart pounded. This was no longer about difficult working conditions. This was about survival. Stay and continue to endure Meghan's abuse. Leave and risk being branded a failure. It was the kind of trap only someone with true power could create. Now let's pause. What kind of boss threatens the very people who sacrifice everything to protect them? What does that reveal about character, about priorities, about truth? Amy tried to reason with Meghan. She spoke calmly, explaining that the workload was unsustainable, that the pressure was too much. But Meghan wasn't listening. She leaned in, reminding Amy that no one in the palace was irreplaceable, that aides came and went, that if Amy didn't fall in line, she'd simply be another resignation on a long list, easily dismissed, easily forgotten. The cruelty of that statement was staggering. Amy had given her loyalty, her health, her very identity to this role, and now she was being told she was disposable. And yet, Meghan wasn't entirely wrong. The palace had a way of burying stories. Aides left quietly, their struggles hidden under the official line of personal reasons. The world rarely knew the truth. Amy knew if she walked, her story might never be told. She would vanish, just another name on a list of those who couldn't survive Meghan's orbit. But here's where the twist comes. That very threat, the ultimatum Meghan thought would trap Amy, became the push she needed. Because in that moment, Amy realized something devastating. Meghan didn't value her. Not as a professional, not as a person. She was a tool, a shield, a buffer, nothing more. And once that realization set in, Amy's loyalty fractured completely. Still, leaving wouldn't be easy. Amy began planning quietly, carefully. She spoke to confidants in hushed tones, weighing her options. She rehearsed her exit in her mind, knowing it had to be clean, dignified, final. Meghan might try to smear her, but Amy's reputation was strong enough to withstand the storm. And yet, the fear lingered. Because Meghan's power wasn't just in her voice. It was in her reach. She had Harry by her side. She had media fascination. She had the public wrapped around her finger. If she painted Amy as the villain, people might believe it. That fear nearly kept Amy in place. Nearly. Let me ask you this. Would you stay in a toxic situation out of fear for your reputation, or would you risk everything for freedom? Amy chose freedom. Quietly, decisively, she set her exit in motion. And while the palace prepared its bland statement about her personal decision to step down, Amy carried with her the weight of everything she had seen, everything she had endured. She hadn't spoken out yet, but the silence wouldn't last forever. Because once she left Meghan's orbit, once she was free of the constraints of palace walls, Amy finally had something she'd never had before: perspective. And with that perspective came a decision that would shake Meghan Markle's carefully crafted image to its core. But before Amy broke her silence, before the world heard her side, the palace itself began to shift. The whispers about Meghan grew louder. Staff defections mounted. And Meghan's clashes weren't just with aides anymore. They were spilling into the monarchy at large. And Amy, watching from the sidelines now, realized something chilling. Meghan's war with her staff was only the beginning. Her real battle was with the crown itself. What happens when whispers turn into a chorus too loud to ignore? That's what the palace began to experience once Amy Pickerel walked away. For a while, Meghan's clashes with staff had been hidden, contained behind the polished facade of Buckingham and Kensington. But as more aides left, as more stories trickled out, the silence cracked. And Amy, no longer bound to absorb Meghan's fury day after day, watched as those whispers grew louder, clearer, and more damning. Inside the palace walls, a culture of silence had always reigned. Staff were trained to endure, to swallow insults, to never complain. Keep calm and carry on wasn't just a British saying. It was the code of survival in royal service. But Meghan pushed that code to its breaking point. One resignation could be explained away. Two, perhaps dismissed as coincidence. But when aide after aide walked out, the pattern became impossible to ignore. And soon, those who remained began to talk, not to the press at first, but to each other. Imagine those quiet conversations in palace corridors. Junior aides whispering to senior ones. Did she scream at you too? Staff huddling in corners, sharing stories of late-night calls, impossible demands, public humiliations. People who had once felt alone suddenly realized they weren't. Their experiences weren't isolated. They were systemic. Meghan's behavior wasn't just difficult, it was toxic. And Amy? She became a reference point. Staff would say, if even Amy couldn't survive, what chance do the rest of us have? Her departure was more than a resignation. It was a signal. The strongest, most loyal aide, the one who had endured the longest, was gone. And that gave others permission to admit the truth. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. Whispers inside the palace rarely stay there forever. They have a way of slipping out, carried by frustrated staff, overheard by journalists, pieced together into narratives. Soon, the British press began to circle. Headlines hinted at difficult Duchess rumors. Anonymous sources spoke of tense palace staff meetings. It wasn't a full-blown scandal yet, but the seeds were planted. Amy, from the outside, watched this unfold. She hadn't spoken publicly, not yet, but she knew every story being whispered was true because she had lived it, and the guilt gnawed at her. She had shielded Meghan for so long, had absorbed so much, had protected her from scrutiny. And now, with her silence, was she still protecting her? Here's the contradiction. Amy had left Meghan behind, but she hadn't left the burden. She carried it with her, the knowledge of every scream, every broken aid, every clash with tradition. She wanted to move on, but the stories followed her. People reached out, asking her what really happened. Was it true Meghan had shouted at staff? Was it true aides were reduced to tears? Was it true Meghan had clashed with senior royals? Amy said nothing, but the silence itself was telling. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy it felt like a chain around your neck? That's what Amy carried after leaving. She wanted to protect the institution, but she also knew the truth mattered. She wrestled with that contradiction daily. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the whispers hardened into consensus. Meghan wasn't just difficult. She was dangerous, to staff morale, to tradition, to the monarchy's image. Senior officials began to strategize. How to contain her. How to protect the crown. Some even began to quietly brief journalists, planting stories to prepare the public for the narrative shift. And here's the irony that makes this chapter sting. Meghan, who had spent so much energy controlling her image, was now being undermined by the very institution she had tried to bend to her will. Staff who once endured in silence were beginning to push back, subtly but powerfully. Every resignation became a headline. Every rumor became a question mark over her carefully curated brand. Amy watched all this with mixed emotions. Relief, because she was free from Meghan's orbit. Guilt, because her silence still protected the woman who had caused so much harm. And dread, because she knew the palace couldn't contain this forever. Let me ask you this. What happens when the people who know the truth finally decide silence is no longer enough? Because that moment was coming. And Amy, whether she wanted to or not, would find herself pulled back into the storm. The walls of the palace could no longer hold the whispers. The press was circling. The monarchy itself was feeling the tremors. And Meghan Markle's carefully constructed facade was about to face its first real collapse. But the real explosion? That wouldn't come from whispers. It would come from the press. From the media storm that turned palace gossip into global scandal. And when that storm broke, Meghan's image and Amy's silence would never be the same again. What happens when whispers ignite into wildfire? When palace gossip, once confined to quiet hallways, spills out into the open, amplified by the press until the whole world takes notice. That's exactly what happened next. Meghan Markle's reputation, once burnished as the fresh, modern Duchess bringing Hollywood sparkle to an ancient institution, suddenly began to tarnish. And the media storm that followed didn't just expose Meghan. It dragged the palace, the staff, and even Amy Pickerel back into the spotlight. At first, it was subtle. A headline here, a column there. Phrases like challenging to work with or difficult Duchess crept into the tabloids. Insiders whispered to journalists about staff turnover, about aides in tears, about the 4 a.m. emails Meghan was notorious for sending. Nothing too damning, nothing confirmed. Just enough to stir curiosity. And for a while, Meghan dismissed it as the British press being cruel. But behind the scenes, Amy knew better. These weren't inventions. They were echoes of the truth. Have you ever seen a reputation unravel piece by piece? It doesn't happen in one dramatic blow. It frays slowly, then all at once. The turning point came when a major newspaper ran a front-page piece about Meghan's staff departures. The Sussex Survivors Club, they called it, referring to the handful of aides who had endured her temper and impossible demands. It was cheeky, but brutal, and the palace couldn't ignore it anymore. Suddenly, Meghan's treatment of her team wasn't just an internal problem. It was a public scandal. Amy, watching from outside the palace, felt a chill. Every story the papers printed, she had lived. The screaming matches, the impossible demands, the tears of junior aides. She had shielded Meghan for so long, had taken the brunt of the fury herself, but now the shield was gone, and Meghan was exposed. But here's the twist. Meghan didn't retreat. She doubled down. Instead of softening her image, she leaned into the narrative that she was a victim of a cruel institution and an unfair press. She and Harry began shaping their own story, one of persecution, of being silenced, of racism and bias. To the public, it was compelling. To those inside the palace, it was infuriating, because the truth was more complicated and much darker. And Amy knew it. Let me pause here. What does it say when the people closest to you, those who work the hardest to protect your image, can no longer defend you? What does it say when silence, once a shield, begins to look like complicity? For Amy, the media storm was agonizing. Reporters reached out. Former colleagues whispered about giving statements. But Amy hesitated. She still felt bound by